Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. This is Irish AIDS Day 2022, the 15th of June, and I want to welcome you all to our discussion today, which has been prompted by the recent call for expressions of interest by government to design, produce, and erect a monument a national monument, in fact, to HIV and AIDS in Ireland. I am delighted to be joined by a panel of very illustrious speakers who are going to talk on this topic today. And I want to, if I can, briefly introduce who they are before we meet them. So without further ado, we will be joined today by Tonie Walsh, who is a leading HIV and gay rights activist, a journalist, a DJ, founder of GCN and the Irish Queer Archives, and for a time in the 80s was president of the National Lesbian and Gay Federation. We're also joined by Terrie Colman Black, another founder of ACET Ireland, AIDS Care Education and Training, and the founder of its quilt group, and which she continues to lead. Terrie's work has featured in academic conferences and in leading peer-reviewed journals, and she has collaborated with many groups around the world, including the National AIDS Memorial in San Francisco. Also joining us is Maeve Forman. Many of you will know Maeve, who formerly is assistant professor of social work in Trinity College and has accumulated decades, over 28 years of approaching 30 years of community work and social work practice experience. She worked as a senior medical social worker in HIV for 15 years and as a medical social worker in oncology and hematology. And finally, for Patricia Conway, formerly a registered nurse at Unit 3 Cherry Orchard Hospital, and many of you will know what I'm referring to there, where she provided care, including terminal care, for people who use drugs and people who had hemophilia and others with AIDS-related illnesses at the time. And she is a former member of the Management Council of the Analythi Drugs Project and former chair of the Irish Bishops' Drugs Initiative of the Irish Catholic Bishops' Conference. So I'm joined by a panel with a wealth of experience and knowledge in this area, and I want to thank all of them for joining us today. So why are we here today, and what do we want to talk about? But it is Irish AIDS Day, and it's something that we mark every single year, and it's important to do it. And the government's publication of their call for expressions of interest is very timely. This year is 40 years since the first reported cases of HIV and AIDS in Ireland. So last year, we had the 40-year anniversary globally, but this is the 40 years since it's been in Ireland. And it has been a very difficult time, and it is also a time of great development and entering a time of great hope. And we hope that we can sort of explore some of that in the context of what it means to have a National AIDS Memorial. The title of the presentation today is These Fragile Lives, the Role of Communities in Memorializing HIV and AIDS. And the title comes from an interview that was done by Cleve Jones, founder of the Names Project AIDS Quilt in America, the memorial quilt in America, which, of course, as you all know, grew exponentially as the project, touching many countries, as a way to memorialize and remember those who were lost to AIDS. He spoke in 2016 at the publication of his book, of his memoir, to a journalist, an NPR journalist, Terrie Gross, and he recounted his work and life. He had been a staffer with Harvey Milk, and he knew Harvey before his assassination in San Francisco, and he had worked as an activist in the 80s at the very, very height of the crisis. And one of the questions that Gross asked him was it hard to learn how to be happy when you lost so many of your friends to the epidemic? And Jones said, I'm still learning. I think anyone who goes through that kind of experience with that kind of the enormity of the loss, it's similar, I think, to being in a war. And I think of my friends every day. There are some days when it is so painful I can't really barely function, but I have to, and I do. I find that I get my strength from my community and my friends. And I am surrounded by people who went through the time with me. And we support each other. And we love each other. And we are grateful for every bit of laughter and joy that comes our way. And so perhaps we can meet the panel, and we can kick off maybe with the question for Tonie. Welcome everybody. Tonie, we might start with yourself. You have worked for many years and decades in this area. You have a long-standing interest in memorializing HIV and AIDS and in being an activist in this area. Can you tell us about that and about your work in relation to, bringing this kind of thing to fruition?
Sure. And listen, by the way, thank you so much, Stephen, and HIV Ireland for actually facilitating us today and doing this. It's really, really important. And we have to, I think, hopefully by the end of our discussion, anyone will agree with us around necessity for the community at large to actually own this project. It's really, really important. And I think each of us here today has something to say that actually qualifies that necessity. Living through the AIDS pandemic, it was only much later on I realized that I'd never been allowed sufficiently grieve. I think because we were so busy dealing with the relentless loss and the destruction. And also, if you think of the primary demographics that were initially affected by HIV and AIDS, sex workers, gay and bisexual men, inner city drug using communities, all of those demographics were bound by, or were tainted in the public mind by criminality and taboo and transgressiveness and marginalization and exclusion. And I think all of those factors actually bore down on our capacity, both as communities and as individuals, to really parse what we were going through. And it's only decades later, I think, that we're at a sufficient remove. And by the way, Russell T. Davies, who wrote the excellent It's a Sin, which really prompted a lot of reminisce about that period. I mean, he made the point last year in interviews that he wasn't able to do, for much the same reasons that I couldn't, he wasn't able to actually talk about it while the worst of it was unfolding. I think now we're at a sufficient remove. I mean, it is history, although, and I think we'll probably come back to this, people are still dying of AIDS around the globe, and they're still dying of AIDS in Ireland. We're at a sufficient remove to be able to make some sense of it, to modulate our own grief, and to also ask what we, as a society, we can do to actually make sense of that period. And I mean, it's no coincidence that the year Cleve Jones published his memoir, 2016, I was at a World AIDS Day seminar in Maynooth University. It was organized by the Department of Media Studies. And it was designed, it ran for several years. It was an initiative by Dr. Maria Pramaggiore and Dr. Porrick Kerrigan. And it was designed to work up some conversations about not only the place we find ourselves in today, but also look at what we can do to actually memorialize the period. And in 2016, I actually gave a paper where I called out the need for a memorial. And since then, I've been delighted to see that actually, particularly your organization, HIV Ireland, has run with this project and has owned it. And I think given that you're one of the longest running NGOs in the country working at the coalface of HIV education, HIV AIDS education prevention, it seems quite opposite that HIV Ireland has actually has done a lot of running on this project, and has also been a persuader to both government and other agencies to actually move with it. I mean, I'm delighted to see it's happening, but I think, building memorial is not the end of the process, and I'd like to hear what everyone else has to say in that regard.
Well, first of all, thank you for those very kind words, and I would like to pay tribute to you and to the work that you have done in this area. Absolutely, it goes without question, and also to all of the voices who have been calling for a monument or memorializing HIV and AIDS. I think we're one among a myriad, and absolutely, it's really important that we hear those voices as well in this process. But let me ask you this question: what does it mean for gay men, gay homosexual men, to memorialize HIV? What will it mean to have this memorial?
I'd like to think that we could actually force some acknowledgement by society, and especially statutory Ireland, force some acknowledgement of the dereliction of duty. I mean, I don't want our memorializing to be shrouded in negativity and in some sort of misanthropic posturing. What we do need, if we're going to learn anything from the period, we need to acknowledge the shocking dereliction of duty by statutory bodies in this country. Because what you see when you go back and historicize the AIDS pandemic, what you see, and you could argue that it hasn't changed that much today, but I'll temper my cynicism. But what you see when you look at historicize the AIDS pandemic are embattled communities across Ireland, embattled communities struggling to resource their survival in the most difficult situations, and a huge amount of volunteerism. Maeve will talk endlessly, I know we'll talk endlessly about the level of volunteerism, people standing up and being counted to help their brothers and sisters who are dying some shocking deaths. So I think we need to acknowledge a dereliction of duty on the part of government, shame them or whatever it takes. I would like some acknowledgement of that dereliction of duty, and I would like, and maybe if not a formal apology, something that meets, that acknowledges the hurt and exclusion and marginalization that we felt at the time, the difficulty that we felt. Lots of people we know of, I mean, it's difficult to quantify, but we know of men and women who actually left Ireland to die abroad because they felt Ireland wasn't a comfortable place to acknowledge their condition at the time. That's really shocking. Yeah. And those stories actually need to be heard. We need to use the monument, I think, and maybe I'll hold this thought for later on, but I think you need to use the monument to engage in a process. I mean, I think just building the monument is not enough. It has to be embedded in a wider process of cultural and social engagement. Yeah, and I think the gay community particularly feels that necessity. And also, too, let's face it, we need to. I think if we're going to build a monument and use it to our advantage for everything that it can say in terms of being a transmitter of oral history, in terms of sort of making some commentary on the place we find ourselves in today, hopefully we can actually apply that to rising levels of infection, ask some cogent questions about why our sexual health education strategies are, notwithstanding the best capabilities of organizations like your own, but why sexual health education strategies are failing some people. And we still have rising levels of STIs and HIV in this country that we shouldn't really have.
Well, you mentioned embattled communities, and I might bring in Maeve at this point. Maeve, can you talk to us about those communities, those embattled communities, maybe going back to the time when it was at the very height of the crisis, and what you witnessed and experienced there, and talk a little bit about those communities?
Okay. I was actually struck by your opening remarks when you used that quote referring to it being a war situation. And I think when you look at the scale of infection and death among some communities, it was like a war situation, particularly in those early days when there was a huge amount of stigma, a lot of fear of infection, a lot of unknowns. And I think it wasn't just the gay community, there was the haemophilia community. A lot of those lads, they'd grown up together because they were living with a lifelong chronic condition, which necessitated in and out of hospital all the time. So they all knew each other. So each death in that community affected everybody. And the same with the inner city drug using communities. And I think one thing that really struck me at the time, and I'm sure Tonie might have discovered this as well, there was less stigma in the inner city drug using communities because there wasn't a street or a block of flats that didn't have somebody infected or affected. So there was great camaraderie. But because at the time it was illegal to be gay, it was illegal to buy condoms, it was illegal to have an abortion, it was hugely difficult for some gay men to be open about their sexuality. So they, as Tonie said, a lot did go abroad, or they hid their sexuality from their family, from their friends, from their work colleagues, and therefore had to hide their diagnosis. So they missed out on essential support because of the fear of stigma, the fear of being outed as well. And I'm just kind of thinking back to that time in terms of communities being affected. I remember going to a funeral in the South Inner City and talking to a young lad, and he can't have been more than about 20, 21. And he'd sat up, and it's like the war situation, he'd sat up the night before and counted 55 people that he had known, that had died. It's upsetting.
Oh my goodness.
That had died in the previous 2 years. And they were like family, friends, siblings, people he had grown up with. And I think I know, Tonie, you probably know this person as well. There's another gay man I know, and he had a photograph of a group of friends. There was 20 in the photograph, and he was the only one left standing. So I think that the fact that we're thinking about memorializing HIV, and I'll talk more later about what it might mean or how it might be manifested. I think there's thousands of people in Ireland who were affected during those early days who didn't get an expression, a form of expression. And we will want to talk about the service and the quilting
Well, can I ask you though about those communities? And I just want to say, and we've been talking beforehand, Maeve has very kindly joined us, having just undergone a little bit of surgery. So she just asked me to mention it, but it's all is well, and we're so happy to have you with us, Maeve. And it is a very upsetting thing to have to recall that time and people that we've known or have been friends and colleagues and family members and partners. And there is a huge sense of loss, and that is part of what we do when we memorialize. I want to talk about those communities though, because what's really interesting is we've been talking, and the stigma question comes up again and again in relation to HIV, and it comes up again and again in relation to the times that were past. But there were somewhat different experiences within the communities of that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's an interesting aspect of what happened at the time.
I mean, I know at the time we did try to kind of really analyze, like, what is the stigma about and how can it be challenged? Because that was the one thing that we could change. Do you know what I mean? You couldn't change certain elements of people being infected, but we could actually change the stigma that affected who people told, how they got support. And I mean, I think it was a mixture. I mean, obviously in the early days, there was a huge amount around fear of infection. There was a lot of ignorance around, and that was something that really had to be challenged. There was fear of discrimination because of homosexuality. I mean, that was a huge issue for a lot of people. And then I think there was stigma around the fact that it was something that was sexually transmitted or transmitted through drug use. And I think Tonie's already mentioned this, that a lot of the groups initially affected were already marginalized. I mean, the haemophilics were marginalized because they were a disabled group, and we treat our disabled people abysmally in this country.
Yes.
The drug use, people forget that at the time, there was no drug treatment. Myceptone or methadone was only available to pregnant women. There was no drug treatment in the community. There was no drug treatment in the prisons. There was no needle exchange. And the whole kind of drug treatment philosophy at the time was rehabilitation, not harm reduction. And there was a huge kind of campaign within NGOs for the National Drug Treatment Service to adopt a harm reduction method. And that was a long time coming. So when we initially got the test in 1985, countries or cities like, say, in England, like London, that had drug treatment had a really low incidence of HIV among their drug using population. But cities like Glasgow, Edinburgh and Dublin that didn't, they were the largest single group testing positive initially. And that was something that was completely avoidable if drug treatment services had been operated differently at the time.
And what was the impact on those communities?
In terms of, I mean, I suppose like if you look back at time, we started testing people in 1985. The so-called new drug treatments didn't come along until 95, 96. So there was a 10-year period, and I'm sure Trish will remember this well and can talk about this. There was this 10-year period where there was no treatment. Once you got a diagnosis of AIDS, your life expectancy was no more than 3 to 5 years, I think. I might be correct in saying that. Trish can correct me if I'm wrong. So once people began to develop symptoms, they were into dealing with a life-threatening condition for which there was we could treat some of the symptoms, but we couldn't So like when you look at the changes in treatments now, it's incredible.
Yeah. Can I come to you then, Patricia, on that? You were there really at the coalface and working in Cherry Orchard Hospital and meeting people who were struggling towards end of life. Can you describe the impact that had on the community? And actually, we hear a lot about the incredible, perhaps the solidarity that may have grown up within those communities. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, there was quite a bit of solidarity between them. The disease. I'm sorry, I can't talk. I can't.
You're grand.
No, if you go on to the rest, and I'll try and come in later.
I will. Well, maybe I'll come to you, Terrie, if I can, because we're talking about the communities that people are traditionally speak of when we talk about HIV and AIDS in Ireland. But you've come at it from another community who maybe isn't mentioned as often when we talk about HIV and AIDS and its impact. Do you want to talk a little bit about that community and where they meet, I suppose, the other communities in terms of memorializing HIV? Perhaps a little bit about that struggle.
Sure, yeah. Well, apologies for my background because I'm actually abroad, so I'm in a hotel, so it's not quiet. Well, I just want to go back a little bit, Stephen.
Yeah.
30 years ago, and I met some of these wonderful people that are on this screen then when I co-founded ACET. And I think the thing that probably impacted me most, and when Maeve was talking, it touched me so deeply because I know what that was like. The thing that touched me, that I just couldn't get over when we started, somebody said to me, it'll be like the floodgate opening when you offer your service of care. And it was, but what I wasn't prepared for was the multiple deaths in families, where a whole generation in one family died. And that today still touches me so deeply. I remember sitting with a mum in a chapel as she buried her third, and the fourth was ill, and I hadn't got any words. I just had no words because there wasn't any. But to sidestep and go back to what you talked about was, I was asked 29 years ago, I was asked in one of the inner cities projects, would I start a local quilt group? I know there was the wonderful Irish AIDS quilt. But, so I said, yeah, because I have a particular interest in crafting, so along I go. And like, again, somebody else mentioned, at that first meeting, 70 names were thrown at me. And I'm like, okay, where am I even going to start with this? How do we begin to think about memorializing 70? And I knew that was a tip of the iceberg, and it was. So we sat down, we got a core group going, and we started to sew quilts. And next year, we are celebrating 30 years in this group of quilting, and there are still 3 of us standing, or whatever, it's still involved. And
That's wonderful.
It's one of those things where we went through, and I think Tonie touched on it earlier, the emotional remembering and sewing of those panels, remembering who had died, getting their personal possessions, putting them on that quilt, sewing them, having times of extreme grief in that room where nobody could talk, and having times of extreme laughter as well, where we literally sat around and we just laughed because we remembered good times as well. So here we are, and as I said, we are still memorializing, and we will continue, and we still get requests. We said to people, you can come to sew with us. You can join us if you want. You can commission. We'll do it for you, or we will give you the material. We will help you do it, whatever you want to do. So yeah, we're still there, and we're still getting requests. And I suppose 15 years in, we decided on a quilt of hope because we felt we wanted to do that. We were quite burdened by the whole emotion of the deaths and continual deaths and grieving. So we decided that we wanted to focus on that, and actually that was a wonderful quilt. And from that, we actually also did a community one. And that was a real eye-opener, because I don't live in the particular community, because people kept throwing out, oh, remember this, remember that. So we actually quilted a history of the community. And of course, huge in that was the funeral home. So,
Yeah.
So.
And you were involved in the National AIDS Memorial also in San Francisco. Can you tell us how that arose and that?
Okay,
and
the Grove, the
Yeah.
Grove, and actually this weekend just gone, and I'm actually here in the US, but I couldn't get to it. They laid out the quilts. You can get it online if anybody wants to look at it. They laid out 35,000 panels, just because they are celebrating their history. So the Grove, I got involved because when I got involved in AIDS, obviously San Francisco was huge in the story, in the worldwide story. So I was always reading in Clev and all those who were the early pioneers. And I remember them when they started the Grove. I thought, this is amazing. this, we're not even anywhere near that. But I just want to give you one little. I did the virtual walk for them 2 years ago. I walked around my garden, pretending maybe this is San Francisco, but it wasn't. But I just wanted just a little tidbit, because I don't want to take everyone else's time. When we couldn't meet, which we know what that was like, we all know what isolation was like during COVID. I managed to get my hands on some of the material that had been donated for us to sew, and started to make masks. So I made, just at home, I made hundreds of masks. And I connected with the woman who looks after the quilts in San Francisco. She was doing the same thing. She was using some of the material they'd been donated, and she was making masks. And I still remember that particular moment as, this is universal.
Yeah.
This is still worldwide. And to have a memorial to me would touch my heart so deeply, I can't even give you the words.
Well, can I ask you about the community that ACET that works with, which is the African and migrant community in Dublin? What would it mean for that community for a memorial in this way, and how does that community intersect?
Sure. If you think about it now, there are a huge number of people living in Ireland who are not. They might have been born in Irish, but they're in Ireland, but they might be Black Irish, etc. There's lots of different. For them, they left a country, or their family left a country and left behind a huge, amazing amount of people dying and still being infected, because, like we were saying, we couldn't get the treatment and we couldn't get the testing. In parts of Africa, they still can't. They can't get anything. So a lot of people left Africa, came to live in Ireland, thinking maybe things are better, which they are. But they have brought that grief with them here, and they have no way of memorializing that. And their voice is quite small, if you think about it, because they don't want to, a lot of them, they're not maybe legal, or they don't want to disclose their status. It's very hidden, and it's very difficult. And they're also coming from a very different perspective. The older African community would still say they are African. The young people we're Irish. So it's trying to blend that has caused, obviously, difficulties within that community. But we would work, and we have a specific worker who's working with us, alongside us, working in the African communities. And he would constantly talk about, nobody's going to say this, like he has a mobile testing, but they won't, people won't come forward, no, because they're so frightened. And it's breaking that down, and for them, a memorial, and to have them included would be just vital and so important. Because they're like a little voice there. They're there, but they're like a little voice that still hasn't been heard.
Trish, can I come back to you with that? I think you're on mute there.
And I would come back to you. I will talk to you on the phone. Is that okay?
That's fine. That's fine, Trish. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Yeah,
okay.
If you want to do that. Yeah.
Okay.
So I just want to come back a little bit, because we're time is moving on, and we're thinking about what it would mean to put this memorial in place for the various communities that are need to be represented. How should somebody designing this memorial, how should the artist capture, or what approach should they adopt to ensure that the experiences that are there within these communities feeds in, informs what this memorial can be? And we see different memorials around the world. The one in Amsterdam is quite striking, and it's the picture that we've used for the slide in advance, and it's the numbers one, where it's counting is the theme of the memorial, where it's like an abacus on a high stand, and the abacus is counting the number of people who died, but also counting down to the target for ending new HIV transmissions, the global goal in relation to HIV. And the artist has managed to capture both in their representation. But Tonie, if I could come back to you, what is the function of a memorial, and how should the artist capture those communities and those experiences?
Terry's enunciated beautifully one of the primary focus of a memorial: education. But I think there's a few things. First of all, we have a physical totem, which has been proposed in the People's Garden in Phoenix Park, in a lovely parkland setting. A physical totem, whatever form that takes, whether it's abstract or figurative, or it's a cenotaph or something, it's a place where we go to grieve. But I'd also like to imagine that it also becomes a place that can be a conduit for protest, for street theatre, for poetry readings, for a gamut of cultural and social expression. There's a physical totem, but then I think it's the process that actually pushes on is the thing that really exercises my interest, and I feel we need to use the memorial to develop a library of oral histories. Now, sadly, the people who were are most capable of actually informing how we got through the AIDS pandemic are dead. They died of AIDS. But I think we can find a way to give a voice. We can find a way to give a voice, put a name and a face on the people we lost. Too many people, as Maeve said, too many people that we lost. And many of us of a certain generation are still grieving for every single day of our lives. We need to put a name and a face on those people. We need to give them back their identity again, because their identity was stolen from them, and for a myriad of reasons. The other thing is we need to find a way to document stories of survival, how we got through the process, how communities found ingenious ways to survive, to help each other get through that process, because we can definitely actually then use it to the place we find ourselves in today. I think we have to use the monument to actually talk about educating ourselves as a society, to develop a greater sense of collective empathy and compassion towards people who presently have HIV, in some cases also have developed AIDS. Ask ourselves, why are people getting AIDS in Ireland in this day and age when we have access to antiretroviral therapies? Why, for example, the face of HIV is not multifarious in the way that Terrie told us reasons why, for example, Black African women aren't represented. I don't see their faces, I don't see their names, I don't hear their voices in the wider public discourse in Irish society around what it means to be HIV positive today. And I think all of these things need to be addressed and should be addressed by the monument, building it, procuring it, but also then actually using it to actually engage in various processes. When initially I suggested the government should build a memorial 6 years ago, I made the point that I'd love to see if somebody could take it on board, a nationwide transition year art project with prizes and an exhibition that would possibly run around the country, a little bit like the National Treasures project that NMI did a few years ago. A transition year art project, asking 15 and 16-year-olds to visualize what a national AIDS monument would be. and inter alia to get a conversation going in secondary schools around memorializing the pandemic, because it's not in our history books, you know. And we need to address that glaring omission. We need to ask, why is this in our history books? Why is it not a subject on the Leaving Cert curriculum? I mean, we here on this panel know those reasons, but we need to, as a society, we need to ask that question.
And maybe I might come back to Maeve on that, because Tonie mentioned getting through the pandemic. And when we think about this memorial and what this can mean and the functions that it can serve, and we've all already spoke about the quilt that Terrie's involved in and the other national monuments that we've seen around the world. This isn't the first memorialization of HIV and AIDS, for sure. That's not what we're talking about. Communities have in the past found ways to do this and to draw attention to the issue. Can you talk to us a bit about what has come before that might inform what comes next?
I'll talk about both, actually, if that's okay. I mean, I think, again, Tonie and Terrie will remember, we used to have an annual AIDS memorial service in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And it was a forum where the quilts that had been made during that year, each panel was 6 by 3, and 12 panels would be sewn together, and that would form one large quilt. And they were all handed up ceremoniously at the AIDS memorial service. So it was always a lovely event, and one where everybody working in the area, everybody affected, came together. And I know Mary Shannon, who has died, who started the whole quilt movement. Those quilts now have gone into the National Museum, so it's great to actually have them there. But just to pick up from what Tonie was saying, I think when you think about an AIDS memorial, it has to be multifaceted. I mean, it's lovely. I've been to the one in San Francisco. It's lovely to have the idea of a place that you can go to. You know, maybe that would have some kind of amphitheater around it where events can happen and protests and performances. And I know kind of digitally it's possible to have those Q codes or whatever you call them, so if people could put up their phone, they could hear some of the stories of some of the people. And we do have a lot of stories. There have been films made, there's been documentaries, there's been stories from The Silence was made way back in the late 80s, early 90s, featuring the small number of people living with HIV who felt able to be open about their status. So there are some documents. It would be lovely to have everything that exists gathered in the one place, so that when you go to a memorial, you can put up your phone and you're brought into the website, which is continually updated and is a source of education. I think like HIV was a really pivotal time. I said it was illegal to be gay, it was illegal to buy condoms. So from a sexual health policy point of view, HIV drove massive change in this country. Arguably, we wouldn't have had gay marriage without the huge impetus that HIV brought in terms of, I mean, because it was illegal to be gay, the Department of Health couldn't put out safer sex leaflets in 1985. That had to be done by Gay Health Action. So the role that the NGOs played, Corja, which was set up by gay men on the model of the Shanti Project in San Francisco to befriend people who were sick and dying. Open Heart House, there was Friends for Friends, people clubbed together to raise money to improve things in the hospital and to make life easier for people. So there's a whole history there that should be documented and accessible. But I think that the positive elements in terms of the positive impact that HIV forced on our sexual health policy and continues to force, obviously there's still a lot more to do. But to actually, as Tonie says, to actually have that HIV and sexual health policy in the school curriculum would be a great thing. So I think that it's a tall order in terms of coming up with a design, because you do want a physical place, but we also need to use cyberspace to continue the education and to gather all the information that we have on that era. So
almost a modern memorial for a modern world is what you're describing. Something that is more than a single piece. It's very interesting. Where in previous discussions we talked about, and I want to just sort of get at it because we've lost Trish, and I want to sort of some of the points that Trish might have made to come out strongly. That community community of particularly in Dublin and in urban areas, but also communities in rural areas, you know, that were impacted, where we couldn't talk about HIV and people didn't talk about HIV or living with HIV, and that included maybe men who have sex with men who may have been married or in relationships, or the experience of isolation, the experience of exclusion. What I want to try and capture is that those communities that don't have a strong voice, maybe when we talk about memorializing HIV, like those communities that were impacted and those families that were impacted in the 80s and 90s, particularly in people among people who use drugs. You know, what would a memorial like this mean to those communities? And I think that might be the question I would have asked Trish, but maybe Maeve, you can come in on that. What is the meaning of memorializing?
Because you talk about something called disenfranchised grief, you know, where you're grieving but can't do it openly, or can't do it openly and honestly. And I think having somewhere like a memorial allows those people who at the time couldn't talk about what happened, it gives them a place to go, it gives them a forum. And I think, as Tonie says as well, if it's not just a physical place, if we're thinking of it as an ongoing commitment to educate, to support, to change, then it you know. So I mean I don't know. I think we need to think it through more. You know, should the memorial commit itself to having an annual forum where these things are discussed? I think Tonie wants to get in there.
Sorry, Tonie.
I'm so delighted to hear you say that, Maeve. If I could just quickly jump in, because my worry in the government, actually, I'm delighted that the government is driving this project, especially as so many of us have called for it for quite a long time. But my worry is that once we build this monument, it will let certain elements in Irish society off the hook. Psychologically, will let them off the hook. And I totally agree with you, Maeve, that it has to be part of, we have to see the physical monument, the building of the monument, as just the beginning of a process that endures. We have to still continuously have conversations around harm reduction. We have to ask ourselves why were certain communities disproportionately or continue to be disproportionately affected by HIV right now. There is a big conversation around the place we find ourselves in right now today, and we can learn from historicizing the period. We can learn much from that. So yes, I just feel that it's a much bigger process, and you're absolutely right, Maeve, about so much of it is going to take part in that more intangible way.
And I think the fact that the largest single group testing positive today, correct me if I'm wrong, are young gay men. And there's been an increase in homophobic attacks. So even though we have gay marriage, we've come a huge way. There's still a lot to do. I think Tonie's idea of the transition year project is brilliant. I mean, that's the age group you want to be getting at and challenging their perceptions and ideas.
And maybe I might bring Terrie back in there. So Terrie, what is the danger then of memorializing? Is it seen then, once the memorials are put in place, almost by statutory powers, by government, as the end of the story? You know, there's the memorial. You have your place to go. You know, that is now, you know, a settled matter for communities. What are the dangers there, and how do we overcome those?
Well, first of all, what I don't want is a slab in St. Venus Park done. Government saying, okay, we've done it. I don't want that. I'd rather have nothing than that. I don't want that. I want what each of you have said. I want a living memorial that will educate and that will remember, and we will never forget the people we lost. That's what I want. I want something really living. I don't want this rushed. I know it's been talked about for years. I know other countries, and I've seen some of them are wonderful, or they're bland, or they're whatever. I am just concerned that the government, you're laughing, Tonie, but I'm concerned that government will think this is it, we've done it. Yeah. Leave it at a slab somewhere. Maybe there'll be names, I wanted a living memorial. I want constant events, if possible, there at the site. I want it to be I want it to be whatever, like illuminated, constantly changing, like you were saying, Maeve, the audio. I want it to be ongoing. I don't want it to be. And that's just, I don't, maybe this is a big personal thing. I just have this thing about, I don't want a slab in the Phoenix Park with names on it. No,
Yeah.
I want it to be living. So that the fabric that we've sewed in the quilt and memorials will be actually not there. People will know, they will feel it when they go there. They will feel that there are people there who we loved and we love, and that we will never forget. And we can only do that if we do it right. And yes, education, well done, Tonie, transition thing, brilliant, absolutely.
Is just to come back to you maybe a final time, Terrie, is there what's been your experience in other memorials? Is that achievable, what you're describing, or have so many of them fallen into the situation you've mentioned?
Well, no, because some of them have. Yeah, they're pretty bland, but they're okay. The one in West Hollywood is worth looking at because they have they're like stakes that they say touch the ground and touch the sky, and as you walk through, they illuminate, especially at night. Now I haven't seen it, but I've done a lot of it online. But there you have you can listen to it, you can hear stories, it's a moving, living thing, and I like that idea because I think living, coming out of loss, is really important. That's what I want.
Yeah.
But, I want that. But I've seen other ones that I've seen one in Canada, and it's like a wave. It's nice, but it's very simple, and it's like a wave. But I want something more than that. I'm sorry.
Well, let me.
I will keep saying
No,
it.
I really appreciate that. I think that's touching a lot of people in terms of how we might feel about it. It's a tall order then, Maeve, for the. I might come to you, Maeve. There's a tall order for the artist to capture this. What can and should they do?
I think one of the essentials is that they engage with the communities directly affected. And when we say communities, we're talking about like physical groups, physical organizations, but also whole areas. I'll just give you one example. In the area where I live in the North Inner City, there's been a huge amount of death through drug use, not just through HIV. So the community commissioned a memorial, and the memorial that won was a local artist, Leo Higgins. And what he did, and again, it means something to the community, and he got them to bring mementos up to the iron foundry where he worked. They went into the cauldron, and they're all encapsulated in the candle in the middle. So it's a very personal one to that community. They know what's in the candle, and it's, so it's a beautiful thing, and it was meaningful to them. And I think if the communities directly affected are consulted in a real way about this, and the whole history is looked at, because it's like it needs to tell the story of the past and the stories of the people, as Tonie said, who've died. And we do have some of those on tape. We do have some of those on film. They do exist. But also looking forward in terms of what we've learned, what we've taken positively from the whole experience of HIV, how it's impacted positively on our social policy, our sexual health policy, our legislation, and then what still needs to be done. So it's like this. I think you're not just going to do it. Definitely not a slab, Terrie. We're all with you there. We need something physical that's beautiful. We need something that will tell a story, but it needs to be a commitment to it being part of an ongoing movement.
Yeah, you're here.
Tonie, then I might come back to you maybe as we're closing. There's a lot in that. It's got to be something that tells a story. It's got to be something that recalls the past. It's got to be something that connects community. It's got to be something that educates. It's got to be a point of pride. It's got to be perhaps a point of protest. It's got to be a living embodiment of the experience. How does an artist go about capturing that, and is it possible? And what are your hopes?
I'm really hopeful if, as Maeve says, the procurement process is wide and transparent and accessible, I am actually, so I don't know. I can't prefigure what this monument is going to look like, or how it might be realized. I do think, though, something that Terrie was saying just struck a chord with me, and that's how I feel we need to be quite clear. All of us who've skin in the game here, representatives of frontline sexual health educators, people who've worked in hospitals at the coalface of HIV and AIDS prevention, the families. We forget about the families of people affected by members who died. Families who are still trying to modulate not only their grief, but their anger at society letting them down, letting their father or their son or their brother or sisters or family member die of full-blown AIDS. We need to remember the families, which people talk about, I hate the word victims, but people talk about people who died of AIDS. We also need to remember the survivors, the lovers, the wives, the husbands, the extended family, and we need to understand what the hurt and anger and bewilderment and grief that many of these people have carried with them over the past 30 years. I also think we need to face up to the reasons why this monument is so necessary. And I'm sure there's going to be immediately, as soon as this becomes big news, we're going to have people trying to invalidate it by saying, "Oh, do you know what? More people died of, on a crude level, there were more people died of COVID than AIDS in Ireland. We only had 400 people, only 400 people." But I think we really need to be quite clear and focused about why it's so necessary to have this monument, we talked about it in the last hour. But that needs to be made explicit on a wider level in Irish society. There's a very distinct reason why we need this memorial.
Well, on those words, I really wanted to thank the members of the panel. It's been an extraordinary discussion and a very informative discussion. And I really want to thank you for all of your input and your insights. We only had an hour, and I'm coming to the closing points, and there's a few more points I want to make for people watching. I'm sorry that we lost Trish in the middle of that, and I'll be catching up with Trish afterwards. But we are really grateful to everybody. So to Terrie Coleman Black, who is in Florida at the moment, in sunny Florida, to Tonie Walsh, who is in an even possibly hotter Turkey over there, and to Maeve Forman, who's in rather cloudy but fairly clement Dublin. Thank you very much for being part of the panel. For disclosure, I'd like to say that HIV Ireland has been a member of the steering group that has been overseeing putting together the call for tender for the monument. But it is then very much an independent process, and we're looking forward to every artist who feels that they can contribute, and every project that feels that they can contribute to put in a call for expressions. And I think the hope is that we will see the best of Irish of representation in terms of what we get in the memorial. But I think there's a job for any artist, and we've made our feelings clear on that. The job for any artist to work on this project to encapsulate and capture all of what we've discussed today and much more that people would like to contribute and should be heard. Anyone who wants to download a copy or view the call for submissions can do so on the government website. We will share that on our social media following this, and you can also Google the call for expressions for a national HIV and AIDS memorial, and it takes you right there. So that is what we'll do. I'd like to thank my colleagues, obviously in HIV Ireland, who have assisted me today, and also to our fantastic partners in Gay Community News and GCN, who are always pulling it out of the bag. And we realize we came at this one a little bit late, but we really wanted to capture the very significant moment of a call for expressions of interest and a very considerable budget for a national HIV and AIDS monument. We're supportive of the project, but we very much feel that it's right and proper that the voices and the experiences of all of the communities that need to be represented and reflected is captured by an artist. And artists are extraordinary individuals, and I put our trust in the artist who will perhaps be selected to do that. So thank you everybody for watching. It only remains me to thank you. This will be available to view back, which I think will be very helpful for people. And I wish everybody a happy Irish AIDS Day 2022. And we look forward to engaging with you again soon. Keep an eye out for future happenings. And thank you all. Good afternoon.